Hoy estamos aquí en torno a un libro que ha traducido y publicado recientemente Casa Asia en el marco de su plan editorial, bajo el título Buzkashi, Juego y Poder en Afganistán. Este es el ejemplar que tienen a su disposición y que ha escrito el antropólogo y diplomático Whitney Azoy, un viejo amigo de la casa porque, entre otras cosas, es colaborador habitual de nuestros cursos y webinars. Así que gracias, Whitney, por estar hoy aquí. Este acto está siendo grabado, así que también un saludo aparte a las personas que están hoy aquí, a aquellos que nos siguen en nuestras redes sociales y página web. En esa labor de difusión de la cultura asiática, Casa Asia ha hecho un enorme esfuerzo después de la pandemia por volcar sus contenidos online. Y en ese sentido, pues agradecemos todo el apoyo de nuestros seguidores en redes sociales y demás, porque la respuesta ha sido muy positiva. Hemos seguido cumpliendo con nuestro mandato de acercar el continente asiático, la región de Asia y Pacífico, también en tiempos de pandemia y como digo, la respuesta del público ha sido muy satisfactoria y eso nos anima a continuar por esa vía. De ahí que este formato híbrido sea el que hemos aplicado hoy, con una parte presencial y otra que podrán seguir los seguidores de Casa Asia online. Como saben, tras la toma de poder el talibán, en agosto del año pasado se puso fin a 20 años de presencia occidental en ese país, en Afganistán. Pero Whitney, we will switch into English in a few moments. El acto será en inglés, pero estas primeras palabras mías serán más en castellano o mezclando. Pero quiero pensar que en esos 20 años de presencia occidental hemos puesto la semilla del cambio, un pequeño germen que esperemos que fructifique en términos de cambios sociales y políticos que eviten que el régimen talibán se implante como lo hizo antes de los atentados del 11 de septiembre. Y en ese sentido, las mujeres, los escritores, la sociedad civil tienen un papel muy complicado en los próximos años, pero que creo que es necesario, como digo, para garantizar un Afganistán en paz y políticamente estable. Casa Asia tiene interés en mostrar otra visión de Afganistán distinta a la que aparece en los medios de comunicación y por eso nos hemos centrado en un juego que tiene una enorme tradición en ese país, como es el Buzkashi. El Buzkashi no sabría muy bien a qué compararlo. Algunos lo comparan con nuestra tauromaquia, con los toros, pero realmente las diferencias son enormes, pero hay que buscar puntos de conexión entre Afganistán por un lado y España por otro y este podría ser uno, ¿no? Hay una tradición, hay una rica tradición de juegos, hay una rica tradición de tauromaquia en el caso de España. Entonces, bueno, pues aquí queremos mostrar otra visión, otra cara sobre Afganistán. Para no alargarme mucho más y cederle la palabra a Whitney, me gustaría en el capítulo de agradecimientos agradecer el apoyo para que este libro haya salido a la luz, a la Embajada de España en Kabul, que ha financiado en parte la traducción, a su traductora, que también nos acompaña aquí, Ana Tuset, y por supuesto al autor del libro, que ha cedido todos los derechos para que esta edición en español sea hoy una realidad. Así que, Whitney, I don't want to take more time. I would like to thank you once again for coming here with this small audience, but a small but quality audience, because they are friends. Some members of the Afghan community have already arrived. In any case, this event will be recorded in our social media and webpage. So the floor is yours, and welcome to Casa Asia once again.
I want to thank the diplomatic community for having taken me to Afghanistan in the first place. The year is 1972, and I am the lowest member of the United States diplomatic staff in Kabul, at the American Embassy in Kabul. Stop me if I'm going too fast. If you don't understand me, please say so. In any case, 1972. And I have a kind of problem. And my problem is that I cannot reconcile the kind of life I am having as a diplomat in Afghanistan with the history of the country. My life as a diplomat was governed by protocol, by rules and regulations. It was orderly. It was predictable. But Afghanistan, the history of the country, has been exactly the reverse. The history of the country has been exactly the reverse. Disorderly, unpredictable, full of what we call nowadays regime changes, full of murders, full of ambushes, full of wars. And I had a difficult time reconciling these two perceptions. So I finally made a friend in the Afghan Foreign Ministry, and I asked him to help me. Here's what he said. Looking around the room, it was at a diplomatic meeting. And looking around the room, he said, here we are always shaking hands and calling each other Excellency. But if you want to know what we're really like, go to a Buzkashi game. So I did. And here's what I saw. It was the birthday of the king, October 15th, in fact, 1972, exactly, outside Kabul. And what I found was a very different world. I found teams with uniforms, but look what they were doing. They were fighting over the carcass, the body of a calf, of a young cow. The name Buzkashi, Buz means goat. Originally they played with the goat. And then after a time, they switched to a calf. Why? Because calf carcasses, they say, last longer. And I found it was a fabulous world. A world of action, a world of surprises, and I have to say a world of violence. I wonder if you can see the calf carcass here, if you can identify where it is. In any case, I was really struck. I was really impressed by the power, by the energy, by the sheer excitement of the situation. I was also impressed by the number of people there. Here, obviously, is a much older photograph. This is from the year 1900. And look how many people there are. What I learned was that nothing else in Afghanistan, at least in northern Afghanistan, where the game is played, nothing else in day-to-day life in northern Afghanistan brought people together, especially men, for the most part, only men, brought people together like a Buzkashi. Nothing attracted the numbers like a Buzkashi. And I thought to myself, little by little, I was getting to know the culture of the country. And I to be honest, I became more interested in the culture of Afghanistan than I did in my work as a diplomat. I respect enormously the work of diplomats. Without them, the world could not function. But I myself, temperamentally at the time, I think a matter of temperament as much as anything else, I could not sit still. I could not sit at a desk. I could not go to meetings that lasted for hours and hours and hours. And here's what appealed to me about this game. So I decided that I would have a kind of midlife career change. I would go from diplomacy to anthropology. And furthermore, I would do a new kind of anthropology. Most anthropology, then and now, studies abstractions. What do I mean by abstractions? I mean topics like social structure, or economics, or politics. And these are fine studies. These are excellent studies. But I asked myself the same question that I discussed a moment ago. What really interests the people? What brings the people together? What kind of event draws them? And again, I learned that, at least in the north where the game is played, north of the Hindu Kush, nothing attracts people so much as a Buzkashi. So I made it the topic of my dissertation. The dissertation became a book. The book now exists in its third edition in English. It has been published in French, and now, thanks to Casa Asia, it exists in Spanish. And what I want to do this evening is talk with you a little bit, not so much about the game, but about my perception of the game, my analysis of the game. Above all, what the game means to the Afghans themselves. There are some Afghans in this room, and at the end, they will tell me how mistaken I am, how wrong I am. I look forward to their criticism. What I suggest to you is that Buzkashi has 4 levels of meaning for the people in Afghanistan, conscious or unconscious. In other words, they are attracted for 4 different reasons. Probably the most important is simply play and fun. It is, after all, a game. And it distracts people from the day-to-day poverty which so many of them experience. Life as a peasant in Afghanistan is pretty boring. And from time to time, they are attracted to something they call a sile. And a sile means something you go to watch. It can be a number of different things, but for our purposes, it's a Buzkashi. A Dutch philosopher named Johan Huizinga wrote a book in the 1930s about play and fun. These are not normal topics for scholars. Scholars think because play and fun are fun, that they're not serious, and they're not worthy of a serious study. But I'm very interested in what he writes here. In effect, he's saying that play and fun are basic parts of life, and furthermore, they cannot be reduced to anything else. They're not only central parts of life, they're basic parts of life. They're kind of like prime numbers in mathematics. You cannot divide them into anything else. I'm not going to talk more about how Buzkashi is play and fun, because it's pretty obvious, even though I concede that it's the most important aspect of the whole the whole experience. Here's a good example, however. You can read it yourselves in Spanish. Here's a good example of what one player experienced. Habib is in that circle there, and Habib was my mentor in the game. By the time I arrived in the 1970s, he was already 60 years old, and he was still playing. And you can get an idea from this quote why he played and how he experienced the game. More important to him while he was playing than anything else. And that's the way it is with games. Last night, for instance, I was watching the New York Yankees, my baseball team, the New York Yankees on streaming TV from the United States. And while I was watching it, nothing else existed. Completely concentrated on the game. How many of us watched the Champions final on Saturday night? Tunnel vision for as long as it lasts. I think that's the main reason why Buzkashi is so important. But there are three other reasons, and to an anthropologist, they are more interesting. One of them has to do with how Buzkashi is for the northerners in Afghanistan, particularly for the Turkic speakers, the Uzbek, the Turkmen. There were a few Kazakh when I was there, even a few Kirghiz in the Wakhan corridor, but mostly for the Turkmen and the Uzbeks. Buzkashi was a reenactment of their ethnic heritage. I think most of you are aware Uzbeks and Turkmens are Turkic speakers, and they were part, two different migrations, but they were part of the enormous Turkic-speaking migration that came from East Central China westwards, all the way into Europe, all the way into Hungary, for instance, and certainly into northern Afghanistan, between the 6th and the 11th centuries. Genghis Khan was, Chengiz, as they call him in Afghanistan, was the most, in some ways the most recent. Tamerlane was a Turkic speaker, but he came from a Timuri Lang. He came from a group already established in what now is Uzbekistan. Anyway, if you look at this map, particularly the map on the right, you will see how in the northern part of Afghanistan, north of the Hindu Kush Mountains, which divide the country into two parts, they are the curse of Afghanistan because they divide it into two parts. The north and the south are very different. The north is part of Central Asia, and the south is part of the Indian subcontinent. You don't see the mountains here. Take my word for it that they run from the northeast to the southwest, diagonally across the country. And in the north, you find the Turkmen and the Uzbek. And it may be that Buzkashi, who knows, it may come from a sort of stylized reenactment of a raiding of one community, raiding the livestock of another. For those of you who are interested, here's a text from the Afghan government suggesting that Buzkashi is somehow related with Genghis Khan and the rest. Well, maybe and maybe not. Equally, it could be a reenactment of pastoral economics. a reenactment of livestock management, much as American rodeo is. American rodeo celebrates the skill of cowboys, again, in a very stylized way. And it reminds the people of the Wild West. And they take great pride in being the descendants of the cowboys and so forth and so on. I will not comment on the politics of the United States at the moment and the guns, but I'm afraid that a lot of the problem comes from this community. In any case, here's Habib again. You can see him. His head inside the yellow circle. I draw attention to him because at the end, I'm going to show you a terrific film that stars Omar Sharif and Habib. Part of the attraction for these people in the North has to do with horses and the kind of culture. It's almost a religion, you can say, of horses. And how horses are enormously important to these people. I'm trying to think of an analog. Well, here's an unpleasant analog. In Mexico, there is a custom, a tradition of fighting two cocks against each other, gallos, roosters against each other. And the owner of the roosters, one rooster, another rooster, identifies very, very closely with that animal. The same is true, even more so, with horses and their owners in Afghanistan. Here is a quote from the 1850s that gives you an idea of how the certainly the best remembered king of Afghanistan during the entire 19th century was Ghost Muhammad. And here's a quote from a European visitor at that time. And here is a slide dedicated to a close friend of mine and of Anna, a man named Sardar Hafiz Nawabi, Sardar Mohammed Hafiz Nawabi. Sardar means prince. And this man is dead now, died recently, in fact, nearly 100 years old. An enormously strong, authoritative person. A person, as we say in English, if he said jump, you would say, how high? He says jump, you say how high? How high do you want me to jump? An enormously strong person. A member of the Mohammed Zaid family, married to the daughter of the brother of the last Khan of Baluchistan. Is that correct? No. And he was famous. Had a big home in Kabul, had a home in London, had a home in Tashkent, and he had a home outside Balkh in northern Afghanistan, in a village called Charbolat. And in Charbolat, he kept the best horse in all of Afghanistan, the Buzkashi. Everybody knew about it. Everybody recognized this horse. It was the horse Asli Sardar Hafiz, a Kashka. Famous horse. And you can see it coming into the game. You can see the neck and the head. Basawarish Tosh Palawan. The name of the rider was Tosh. That photograph was taken in 1977. In 1980, Tosh was actually flattened by a Soviet tank. He was part of the resistance, and very extremely widespread resistance, almost a uniform resistance against the Soviet invasion of 1979. Anyway, Sardar Hafiz, because he was a member of the royal family, he was involved in a lot of protocol and kings and so forth and so on. And he once said to me, we were in Charbala in his country home, and he said, oh, it's protocol. He said, it's fine, but it doesn't mean much to me. It really doesn't mean much to me. He said, most of all, I just want to be with my horse. Gives you an idea of sort of centrality of horses in that culture. Okay, a third meaning of Buzkashi has to do with the idea of metaphor, the linguistic idea of metaphor, saying that one thing stands for another when you make a remark. We could say that, for instance, we could say that ring stands for marriage. Well, you could say that in the United States, you could say that Pueblos originales, there's a 4 the 4th of July. One thing stands for another. In Afghanistan, like everywhere else in the world, for the most part, or it used to be this way, not now, but before 1978, before the wars began, life was fairly reliable, fairly ordinary. You would go to bed at night with the assurance that you would be alive in the morning. Things would be more or less calm, more or less tranquil. Okay? But Afghans kept telling me even then, in the 1970s, before the trouble, they would say, oh, Whitney, you know that everything seems fine. Here we're always shaking hands and calling each other excellence. But underneath, there's a kind of volcano. Underneath, there is the possibility of some enormous explosion. And what they would say is that underneath, life is like a Buzkashi. Now, let me show you what I mean in a historical context. From 1929 until 1978, there were 3 rulers of Afghanistan, all from the same family. There were struggles at the top, but on a day-to-day basis, domestically, internally, the life of the people is fairly calm. It's fairly tranquil. It's fairly predictable. Then came the so-called Enqalabi Sour. Sour is a month in the Afghan calendar. Between the 27th and the 28th of April in 1978, a left-wing coup, a Marxist coup, took power in Afghanistan in a way that nobody had predicted. Even the coup people themselves did not think that they could succeed. But they were pressed very hard by the ruler at that time, President Daoud, and they felt that unless they tried something, they would probably all be killed. So they tried this coup, and it succeeded. And since that day, It's been hell in that country. It's been one war after another. And look at the list of the leaders. Murdered, exiled, murdered. And then the Mujahideen finally were defeated by the Taliban. The Mujahideen were the anti-Soviet forces during the 1980s. They were defeated by the Taliban. The Taliban were defeated by the Western coalition. And now the Western coalition has been defeated by the Taliban, and the Buzkashi continues. So, here's my second story. Back in 1978, I am escorting an Afghan VIP, a very important person around the United States. We come to the final airport, John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. It's time to say goodbye. I hear my name on the public addresses. I go to the phone. It's the State Department in Washington. And the State Department is saying, don't put that man on the plane. Don't put him on the plane. There is some kind of revolt in Kabul. It was the Inqilabi Sawa, the Sawa Revolution, which became known as the Fajr Sawa, the Sawa tragedy, because it initiated this long period of warfare, which continues today. Anyway, when I got this message, I went to my beat, whom I had been escorting around the United States. And I said, what does it mean? What's happening? What? And he said, here's what he said. You should know. You've been studying all about it. Now the Buzkashi is about to begin. By which he meant the political turmoil of the last, I'm doing some arithmetic now, 45 years, 46 years, a long time. Okay. The last meeting, getting toward the end of the talk, the last meeting is something really interesting. It has to do with the game and the events that surround the game being an actual arena in which people compete for reputation, which in Afghanistan is the stuff of political power. Individuals competing for reputation and thus political power. How is it different in Afghanistan from Spain, from the United States? In Spain, and theoretically in Kabul, power resides in institutions. Power resides in the office of the president. Power resides in the ministries. Power resides in the legislature or in the courts. And we have come in the West, and I hope we can continue to feel this way. We have come to trust more or less in our institutions. People in Spain trust more in their institutions than people in my country. One of the problems the United States suffers now is that many of us, not all, but many of us have lost faith in the idea of government itself. Can you imagine losing faith in the idea of a central government? But for the most part, in Europe certainly, and in much of the rest of the world, real power resides not in individual people, but in institutions. It's not the case in Afghanistan. Despite the legislative building, despite the Supreme Court, despite the Ministry of the Interior, All of these are wonderful in theory. In practice, they have relatively little power. And power resides instead in individuals. In the countryside, it resides in what we could call local politicians. The Khans. This is another Turkic word. The Khans. Some small Afghanistan Padrat. Bonome Khan. That's the thing. It's an old system. An old system. It's been there forever. And the bottom photograph, I'm proud of this photograph. It was taken in 2005 when the constitutional lawyer Jirga was taking place in Kabul. And the Constitution had to do with the establishment of institutions. But there were some people there who didn't want the institution. And I'm looking at these three men within the blue box. And these are three of the great commanders from northern Afghanistan. Fahim and Dostum and Daoud. And Dostum is reading the second edition of my book. Very pleased. He's reading the second. He's looking at the pictures. Put it that way. His knowledge of English is not very extensive. But there's an idea just of where the real power is. Take a look at this quote from 1857. You can read it faster than I can. I can read it to you. Again, it gives you an idea of how deep-seated this competition between individuals is. People, I would say to people, what good is a name? And they would say, well, if you have a name, what good are followers? Followers give you a name. I'm translating it wrong. But if you see the circle there, you can see how a name depends on your accomplishments. Your accomplishments give you an even greater name. The greater name gives you even more followers. The followers give you even more accomplishments. The greater accomplishments give you even more of a name. And so here is the kind of trajectory that these Khans in northern Afghanistan seek to follow. Now, there are various ways to acquire a reputation, and they have to do with displaying things in public. Some of them are socially useful, like building a mosque, or planting an orchard, or digging a well. And then these things become known as the orchard of so-and-so, the well of Fulana. By the way, Fulana is a word that you have in Spanish. It means so-and-so. And how do you say it in Spanish? Fulana. That's the same word. Some of them are obviously egotistical, like riding a fine horse, or driving a fine car, or living in a two-story compound. The houses are all built within walls. And if your house has only one wall, you don't see anything from outside. But if it's a house that only two walls, Then, these people must be rich, powerful. And of course, being seen with important people. Now, all of these things, all these ways of gathering reputation and displaying it, they are risk-free. You don't risk anything. But hosting a Buzkashi is risky. And as the last thing I'm going to explain why. But against the background of the idea that name, reputation, is a zero-sum game. There is only so much reputation in the world. The more I have, the less there is for you to have. So Buzkashi, reputation is a relative thing. Okay. Traditional Buzkashi, the old Buzkashi, the Buzkashi that I knew when I first began going, around 1976. In the north, sometimes there would be 500 riders on the field, all trying to get control of the staff carcass. You can see the carcass represented up there in the diagram. All trying to get control of the carcass, each person for himself, trying to break free of everyone else, ride free and clear, and then drop it. Voila! They would ride free of everyone else, and then drop it. But the problem is, how free is free? And how clear is clear? And who is to decide? Particularly when the horses and the riders are representing these khans, who are in conflict, or at least competition, with each other anyway. And so it's a potentially explosive situation. And many of these old discussions would explode in violence. And then the man who sponsored the Buzkashi, who sponsored the whole thing, would lose reputation. Why? Because people showed that they did not respect him as the host sufficiently to behave well in the game. Okay. It's very hard to find one of these old games nowadays. But online, you can find anything on YouTube, right? And on YouTube, I found this clip. I hope it's going to work. This clip of a game which is pretty much played the same way. It's in Kyrgyzstan. It's not in Afghanistan. Let's see if it'll work. There are a lot of riders out there. It says more than 1,000. And they've all come for this game, which is sponsored by a local businessman. In Kyrgyzstan, they call the game kokburu. The Department of Buzkashi, 5 cars. to get your goat is an expression in English. This is a play on words at the end here. Javier, what should we do?
We're going to stop here with me and ask if there are any questions. Thank you so much for this comprehensive explanation on Buzkashi from an insider's perspective with me. I don't know if anyone has any question or doubt.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Elena. Thank you very much for this explanation. I'm very new to all this, so I was very interested to know more about it. How often is this type of events organized? Is this like a once per year, very important event where all people gather, or is this more often?
In the north, in the provinces, individual sponsors, the Khans, still organized games, but more and more it is being done by the government. Had we 15 minutes more, if we had 15 minutes more, I would tell you how the game has been transformed into a sport by the government, with far fewer players, with teams, uniforms, referees, boundaries, space and time. These games are usually played on Friday afternoons. Buzkashi is played only in the late fall, and the winter, and the early spring. Why? Because it is too hot for the horses otherwise. And a horse will not play, or they do not play the horses, for more than maybe 6 or 7 minutes at a time. And then they will substitute horses. Same rider. But a Khan, these power brokers in the north, will have a number of horses, a number of good horses, all of which is proud, and blah, 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 blah. And he'll simply put the same rider on one afternoon. So, in the winter only, sometimes in the north, any day of the week, sometimes by a sponsor. Otherwise,
so it's quite often. In some period during the year, it's very often. Almost every day could be.
If you want to go, the place to go is Mazar-e Sharif in the northern part of the country. I'm trying to think of the name of the Buzkashi field there. But in any case, other questions? Mazar-e Sharif, or Malmana, or
Hello, Doctor. Welcome here. خوش آمدید. فکر میکنم فارسی هم میتونید صحبت بکنید. More or less, you can also speak Persian. بله مشکل نیست. تشکر. What do you think about Buzkashi? Do you think it have to provide, like here in Spain also we have the same game, but it's different. They are playing with cow, no? Like more or less, but a little dangerous. It would be private, or what do you think in Afghanistan also?
Do you mean the bullfighting here?
Yeah.
The bullfighting. I think it's very different. Very, very different. As I understand the bullfighting here, first of all, let us talk about the sponsorship. Let us talk about the money. Right? Who pays the money to have these events? As I understand it, here it's a private enterprise. Individuals who are part of this world of the toils, of the bull, organize the events in the stadium, and they provide the horses, and they pay the torneos, and so forth. It's a private thing. I do not believe, especially now, less and less, I do not believe that the government is involved in bullfighting here in Spain. Certainly not in Catalonia, where it has been banned. Right? Secondly, let me tell you a story.
Yeah.
A story. The great Habib, and I'm sorry I could not show you this last clip of my mentor, the great writer Habib. Habib Hazara, they called him. Habib came here to Spain to finish a film, an American film called The Horseman, or Sawakaran. He came here in 1970 and 1971. What happened? The film was going to be made in Afghanistan, and like so many things in Afghanistan, for some reason, it was not completed. Right? Something went wrong in the contract between Columbia Pictures and the government Afghan Film Authority, the Afghan Film Corporation. They bring it to Spain to finish the film. And while they are in Spain, they go to a bullfight. And later, much later, I asked Habib, "Oh, Habib, how was this bullfight?" He called it Gaujangi. Gaujangi. Cow fighting. And I said, "Well, what did you think of the bullfighting?" The Gaujangi, he said, "It's for cowards." Really? It's for cowards? He said, "Yes, because the man always wins and the bull is always killed." And I said, "Sometimes the man is killed too." He said, "Yes." He said, "But then the cow is killed, even after the man is killed." You heard about this. They had a very poor, I can only tell you about, not necessarily my perspective, but his. He said it was unfair. He said it was unfair because the man had the sword, and the sword was what he said. I think it's a very different phenomenon. Yeah. A very different phenomenon. And I also think that the actual, in bullfighting, most of the participants are spectators in the stadium. In the old games up north in Afghanistan, everybody's on horseback, including me. And sometimes 500, 600, 700 people out there. Everybody on horseback. Tremendously powerful experience.
And did you play Buzkashi?
Like a coward. Yeah, I got on a horse. I stayed more or less, how would you say, in the afuera of the game, right? On the outskirts of the game. Once, to my surprise and horror, the king got very close to me, and something happened, and I found the calf right here, across my saddle, right here, and I was terrified. And Habib was there in a second. He grabbed the thing. He said, "Let me have it. Let me have it." He just took it away from me because he knew I'd get killed.
Really, thank you for your presentation, a nice presentation. And also, nowadays, everybody listening about the Taliban, about the new face of Afghanistan, unfortunately, but they don't know the deep culture of Afghanistan. And thank you to your presentation to here, and it's very nice. Thank you, really.
Well, thank you for saying.
You have some message about the culture of Afghanistan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for saying that. I'm only sorry that the presentation had to do with something violent. At the moment, I am working with a man named, some of you will know this name, Masood Khalidi, who is the son of the great poet Khalil Khalidi, and we're working on a book of translations of his poetry. Now, these are not violent. They don't have to do with people getting killed or getting injured. They have to do merely with poetry. And so I'm trying to balance my Buzkashi. Thank you. Anybody else?
Buenas tardes. Thank you. Bienvenido. Welcome. En Pajair Ragle, Kosham. Primero de todo, gracias por presentar a Pueblo Español de nuestro Juego Nacional de Buzkashi. Después de eso, tengo un mensaje para usted y una pregunta. El mensaje es el actual. Antes del 15 de septiembre, el gobierno del presidente de Kunduz, ayer yo le mandé el link de Casa Asia a él, está en el Irán. Entonces, cuando ha leído su nombre, dice, por favor, tenéis que dar muchos recuerdos al señor Whitney. Es el sobrino de Haji Mehrab. Usted estuvo en casa de ellos y ha escrito un libro en casa de Haji Mehrab, me parece, en años 70 y pico. Y luego es el hijo de Haji Gafur, el momento cuando usted estuvo en Kunduz y el presidente del juego de Buzkashi.
Haji Mehrab,
yes. Es su sobrino, se llama Mujibullah Umargel, expresidente de Kunduz. Te mandaban muchos recuerdos, tenía su familia, muchos buenos recuerdos de usted. Y la pregunta es, ellos, el Mujib Umargel ha presentado sus documentos en la Embajada de España en Irán. Yo creo que pronto vendrá en España. Mi pregunta es ahora, ellos quieren seguir con Buzkashi. ¿Buzkashi funcionará en España o está permitida por la ley? ¿Va a permitir, le dejarán que harán juegos de Buzkashi en España? La pregunta es para el señor Javier. Gracias, muy amable.
Well, thank you very much. I think everyone understood. It really touches me to hear these names. These are the people who offered me hospitality after I had left the diplomatic corps, after I had gone to graduate school. When I came back to do my PhD field research, I had to live somewhere in the north, and nobody wanted me. Why? Because I would be a responsibility in case something went wrong. The people who were giving me a place to live, they would be held responsible by the central government if something happened to me in the north. Finally, the governor of Kunduz, a man named Abdul Khalek Rafiki. Rafiki had been a student in the United States. He had the same kind of scholarship, a Fulbright scholarship, in the United States that I had in Afghanistan. And he wanted to reciprocate. So he agreed to let me stay in Kunduz province. And he summoned his Rais Buzkashi, Mirabuddin Khan, and his nephew, Mohammed Akub, who became I'm sorry to say that he is gone now. And of course, there are the being 5 years ago. But Haji Mahfoud is still a very powerful man, very rich, and very strong, physically strong, an amazing man. And I would love to have them come to Spain.
Pregunta Whitney si if you think a Buzkashi would be possible in Spain.
Well, los caballeros o los, pues no sé. But in any event, the weakest part of the action in the section of the film made in Spain, the weakest part of the horses, because they use Spanish horses. The riders were Afghans, most of them. Well, 8 of them. But they used Spanish horses. And they complained afterwards that the horses didn't know how to do anything. Yeah, they complained a lot. But I think it would be difficult unless they bring the horses. If they bring the horses, then why not? But so many people tell them for me that so many people have asked me to bring the game to the United States. The great dream during the jihad was to bring the game to the United States. Oh, Whitney, all you have to do is talk to the great Reagan, Ronald Reagan. All you have to do is talk to the great Reagan. I'm sure you know him well. And he will say, oh, Whitney, what a great idea to bring the game to the United States. I will do it. That was the Afghan sort of dream. Right? In fact, there's a whole chapter in this book about Buzkashi as played in Peshawar. For those of you who don't know, Peshawar is on the Pakistan side of the Khyber Pass. And it was the base camp, the kind of capital of the Afghan resistance against the Soviets during the 1980s. In that time, some of the refugees from northern Afghanistan began to play this game. And 2 men became the kind of entrepreneurs of the Buzkashi in Peshawar. And they had a rivalry, a very bitter rivalry between them. Think, that's chapter 6. But in any case, buy the book, because it's all there.
Bueno, vamos a acabar. Yo creo que aquí ha sido un privilegio contar con Whitney Azoy. Whitney, thank you very much once again.
Very welcome.
Gracias de nuevo a todos por la asistencia, a todos los que han hecho posible, como decía antes, que el libro se haya una realidad. De nuevo a Ana Tuset, la traductora, y al equipo de Casa Asia que ha permitido que este acto tuviera lugar hoy. Gracias de nuevo por estar aquí y bueno, pues este acto quedará grabado para los que estén interesados en seguirlo. Y nada, que tengan muy buena tarde. Y allí hay ejemplares del libro para los que lo quieran adquirir y Whitney yo creo que estará encantado de firmar ejemplares. Así que muchísimas gracias.